For 60 years, she stood in the light. The wigs, the rhinestones, the painted nails, and the mile-wide smile. Dolly Parton became the most recognizable woman in American music, not just because of her talent, though the talent was extraordinary, but because of the image. A total, complete, immaculate image. Every detail curated, every inch calculated, every public appearance a masterclass in controlled presentation. Nobody does glamour like Dolly. Nobody ever did. And yet, there was one thing she never let you see. One detail that survived 60 years of magazine covers and television interviews and sold-out arenas and Hollywood films. One secret so persistent that when journalists finally pressed her about it, she laughed it off, changed the subject, pulled the sleeves of her rhinestone jacket a little lower, and moved on. For 60 years, nobody noticed. Or if they noticed, nobody asked the right question. But what was Dolly Parton actually hiding under those long sleeves? And why did it take her until her 70s to finally tell the truth? The answer is not what you think. It's not vanity. It's not shame. It is something far more human, far more complex, and far more devastating than anything the tabloids ever imagined. It is the story of a body that kept performing while it was quietly falling apart. The story of surgeries nobody knew about, of a grief nobody witnessed, and of a woman who spent 6 decades transforming her pain into art, and her scars into butterflies. This is Dolly Parton. Not the legend, not the icon, the woman. And this is what she was always covering. There is a woman the world thinks it knows. She is sequined and rhinestoned and enormous in every sense. Her laugh arrives before she does. Her generosity is legendary. $100 million to Vanderbilt University. The Imagination Library sending books to children in 40 countries. A quiet donation during the pandemic that helped fund a COVID vaccine that saved millions of lives. She has written more than 3,000 songs. She has sold more than 100 million records. She has been nominated for every award that exists and turned down the Presidential Medal of Freedom twice because she didn't want to make it political. She is Dolly Parton, and the world loves her without reservation. But love, even the most devoted kind, has its limits of vision. We see what we are shown. We know what we are allowed to know. And for 60 years, through every television appearance, every magazine cover, every late-night interview where she laughed and sparkled and deflected with the precision of a woman who has been doing it since before most of her fans were born, Dolly Parton was showing the world exactly what she intended it to see. Not a lie. Never a lie. Dolly Parton does not lie. A performance. The greatest, most sustained performance in the history of American popular music. And you never saw the seams. The wigs have been part of the presentation for so long that most people have forgotten she has hair beneath them. The makeup has been applied with such consistency, every single morning, without exception, including mornings she was sick, mornings she was grieving, mornings the world had fallen apart, that her bare face has become a kind of theoretical concept, something that exists in theory but has never been confirmed by living witnesses. She has said it herself, plainly and without apology. "You're not gonna catch me out in the streets barefaced." She once explained where the image came from, back in Locust Ridge, Tennessee, the mountain hollow where she grew up, the fourth of 12 children, where the floors were bare and the winters were long, and the nearest thing to luxury was a tin of Crisco. There was a woman in town, a woman with loud colors and bright lips and hair piled high. A woman other people whispered about and looked down upon. A woman the community had already decided something about before she opened her mouth. Dolly thought She was the most beautiful person she had ever seen. "That's not a joke," she said years later. "That's the honest truth." She built herself in that woman's image, not out of naivety, not out of bad taste, out of something far more intentional, the recognition, early and clear, that the presentation could be armor, that glamour could be a language, that if you made yourself spectacular enough, people would look at the surface and forget to ask about the foundation. It worked. For 60 years, it worked completely. The long sleeves were always part of the presentation. Nobody questioned them. Why would they? Everything else was so visible. The plunging necklines, the platform heels, the wigs that changed like seasons, that the covered arms seemed like a modest counterbalance, a kind of southern decorum. Even the journalists who spent entire careers writing about her missed it. But the sleeves were not modesty. The sleeves were architecture. Beneath them, beneath the rhinestones and the sequins and the carefully preserved image of the most glamorous woman in Nashville, was a body that had been through something, a body that had been cut and stitched and scarred, a body that had endured years of illness and pain that never made the headlines because the woman inside it never let it. For 60 years, Dolly Parton performed. She smiled through surgeries. She recorded albums while managing a condition that attacks from the inside. She stood on stages in full hair and makeup while grieving privately for the life she would never have. The world saw the butterfly. Nobody saw the cocoon it emerged from. There is a version of Dolly Parton that the world constructed for itself. Invincible, eternal, untouchable by the ordinary cruelties of biology and time. A woman so relentlessly present, so consistently brilliant, so perpetually on, that the possibility of her being genuinely ill, genuinely broken, genuinely frightened inside a body that was failing her, simply never occurred to the people watching from the audience. That version is a fiction. The real version was this: a woman who stood on stages, smiled for cameras, recorded albums, and gave interviews, while her body was quietly waging a war she never announced. A war that left marks, permanent, visible, undeniable marks that she spent the next several decades covering with the most Dolly solution imaginable. Butterflies. But before the butterflies, there was the cutting. The precise nature of the illness that required a feeding tube has never been fully disclosed. Dolly has spoken about it carefully, partially, in fragments spread across decades of interviews, offering enough to confirm the reality without surrendering the privacy she has always guarded ferociously for everything that happens off the stage. What she has confirmed is this: she was very ill. The illness was prolonged. The illness was serious enough to require surgical intervention. And the surgical intervention left something behind. A scar. Not a small scar. Not the kind of scar that fades politely into the background after a few years and stops announcing itself. A queloid scar. The particular kind that forms on fair skin like hers, raised and discolored and purple against the pale, insisting on being seen long after the wound has healed. A scar on her abdomen where the feeding tube had been. A scar that sat there, immovable, a permanent record of something she had survived. And Dolly Parton looked at that scar and made a decision. She was not going to let it be a wound. She was going to make it a garden. She went to a tattoo artist. She asked for a colmea, a honeycomb, intricate and golden, placed precisely over the site of the scar, covering it completely, transforming it. She described her thinking in the way only Dolly can, simple and profound at the same time. I believe in looking for positivity, even in negative experiences. That was the first tattoo. It was not the last, because the feeding tube was not the only surgery. There were others. She has never given a complete accounting, and perhaps she never will, because the details belong to her and to no one else. But each surgery left its mark. Each incision healed in the way her skin heals, raised, colored, permanent. And each time she returned to the tattoo artist. A butterfly here, a ribbon there, a pastel flower placed carefully over a scar that had no business being seen by anyone who hadn't earned the right to see it. Over years, over decades, the tattoos accumulated, all of them pastel. She has been very deliberate about that. Not the dark, heavy ink that announces itself from across the room. Soft colors, lavender and rose and pale gold, the kind of colors that look, from a distance, like a woman simply chose to decorate herself. "I don't have the real heavy dark tattoos," she has said. "Mine are all pastel, and I have more than one." But here is what the pastel colors were always doing. They were hiding the evidence of a body that had been through something real. Something medical and frightening and deeply private. Something that happened while the world was watching her perform and never suspected that anything was wrong. Have you ever wondered what it costs to be that present for everyone else, while keeping something that enormous entirely to yourself? The answer, in Dolly's case, was apparently long sleeves. Always long sleeves. Rhinestone-encrusted, spectacularly bedazzled, undeniably fabulous long sleeves. But long sleeves nonetheless. The image served double duty. The glamour that the world interpreted as vanity was also, quietly, practically, a system of concealment. And it held. For decades, it held perfectly. The journalists who interviewed her over 50 years never pressed the right question. The photographers who shot her for every major magazine on Earth never caught an unguarded moment. The fans who loved her with a devotion bordering on religious never knew that the woman they were celebrating was also, simultaneously, managing a private accounting of her own body's rebellion. She kept performing. Through the surgeries and the scars and the recoveries that nobody documented. Through the procedures and the healing and the trips back to the tattoo artist to cover the latest evidence with something beautiful. She kept performing because that is what Dolly Parton does. The show has always been the point. The woman behind it has always been the secret. But the tattoos were not the deepest secret. Not the one that cost her the most. That secret was internal, invisible to any camera, impossible to cover with ink, impossible to decorate into something beautiful no matter how skilled the artist. And it came not from a surgeon's scalpel. It came from a diagnosis. And it came for the one thing she had always wanted most. In 1984, Dolly Parton was 38 years old. She was, by every external measure, at the height of everything. The records were selling. The tours were selling out. Hollywood had come calling. 9 to 5 had arrived 3 years earlier and announced to anyone who had somehow missed it that the woman from the Tennessee mountains could do anything she decided to do. She was writing songs that would outlive generations. She was building a business empire with the quiet precision of someone who had learned, early and permanently, that talent without ownership is just another form of poverty. From the outside, she was untouchable. From the inside, she was receiving a diagnosis that would alter the architecture of her life forever. Endometriosis, a condition that lives in silence, growing where it should not grow, embedding itself in tissue and organ and the deepest machinery of the body, causing pain that has no visible evidence, no external wound, no scar that can be covered with a butterfly tattoo and transformed into something beautiful. It is internal. It is chronic. And in the early 1980s, it was even less understood than it is today. A condition that millions of women were told to endure quietly, as though suffering were simply the price of being female. Dolly Parton did not announce it. Of course she didn't. She kept performing. She kept recording. She kept showing up in full hair and makeup and rhinestones, while her body was staging a rebellion she refused to acknowledge publicly. That was the deal she had made with herself, somewhere back in Locust Ridge, somewhere in the years of building the image and the armor. You do not let them see you break. But the body, eventually, makes its own demands. In 1984, the demands became impossible to negotiate around. The endometriosis had progressed to a point that required surgical intervention. Dolly underwent a partial hysterectomy, and in a single procedure, necessary, medically correct, the right decision, the possibility of biological children was closed, permanently, without appeal. She was 38 years old. She had always wanted children. This is the part of the story that the long sleeves and the pastel tattoos could not cover. This was not a scar on the abdomen. This was a wound that lived somewhere beneath surgery and diagnosis, somewhere in the space between what a woman plans for her life and what life ultimately allows. She had grown up the fourth of 12 children in a house overflowing with siblings, had spent her childhood helping raise the ones born after her, had always assumed, the way women of her generation assumed many things, that children would come. They did not come. And when they could no longer come, she grieved. She has spoken about this with the particular honesty that defines her at her most unguarded. Not the sparkling deflection of the public performer, but the quieter, heavier voice of a woman accounting for what she actually lost. She describes a depression, not a mild one, a real one, the kind that settles into the bones and makes the stage lights feel very far away, the kind that does not yield to willpower or professionalism, or the knowledge that you have an album to finish and a tour to begin. Have you ever tried to perform joy while carrying grief that nobody around you even knows exists? She performed it. Because that is what the deal required. Because the show has always been the point. Because Dolly Parton built an image sturdy enough to carry almost anything. And she tested that sturdiness in 1984 to its absolute limit. What brought her through was not the image. The image was never load-bearing in that direction. What brought her through was faith, the deep, unshakable Mountain Tennessee variety that had been embedded in her long before the rhinestones arrived. She came to a reckoning, alone and private, with the understanding that the life she had been given was not the life she had planned, and that this was not a punishment. God didn't let me have kids, she said, so everybody else's kids could be mine. 6 words, carrying a decade of grief, a diagnosis, a surgery, a depression, and a complete restructuring of identity, compressed into 6 words that managed to be simultaneously heartbreaking and luminous. She became the Aunt Granny to her nieces and nephews, to Miley Cyrus, her goddaughter, who grew up with Dolly as a fixture in her life and her music, to the millions of children who received books in the mail each month from the Imagination Library. Dolly's most enduring act of love, born directly from the loss she never fully announced. Every book that arrived in a child's hands was, in some essential way, a letter from a woman who had wanted to be a mother and found a way to mother anyway. The endometriosis left no visible scar. The hysterectomy left one. Another queloid line on pale skin. Another mark for the tattoo artist to cover. Another butterfly placed precisely where the wound had been. but the deeper mark was invisible, and it shaped everything. The philanthropy, the imagination library, the ferocious love she extended to every child who came near her. The way she spoke about family with a warmth that went several degrees past professional warmth into something rawer and more personal. The butterflies on her arms were covering the surgeries, but the woman underneath them had been reshaped by something no tattoo could touch. And through all of it, through the diagnosis and the surgery and the grief and the depression and the rebuilding, there was one constant, one presence, one person who had been there since before any of it began, who had watched the image being constructed and had always known the woman inside it. Carl Dean, the man nobody ever saw. The man who, it turns out, she would spend the final years of their nearly 60-year marriage caring for. In private, in silence, with the same ferocious devotion she had always extended to everyone except herself. Carl Thomas Dean did not want to be famous. This, in itself, is extraordinary. The man who spent 59 years married to the most recognizable woman in American music. The woman whose face appeared on more magazine covers than almost anyone alive, whose name was spoken in 100 countries, whose songs played in hospitals and wedding receptions and funeral homes with equal inevitability. That man wanted nothing from the spotlight. Not a single thing. He was a paving contractor from Nashville. He loved trucks. He loved their farm. He loved Dolly, quietly, consistently, without fanfare or performance, in a way that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the carnival of celebrity that surrounded her every waking hour. "He's the one person in my life who has never asked anything of me," she once said. Think about what that means. Think about what it means to spend 60 years as the person everyone needs something from. The fans, the record labels, the charities, the cameras, the interviewers, the entire apparatus of American celebrity grinding against you every day. And to come home to one single human being who simply wanted you to be there. Not Dolly Parton, the icon. Not the wigs and the rhinestones and the smile that could light a stadium. Just Dolly. He called her a little thing. She called him her anchor. For nearly 6 decades, the arrangement worked in the way that only truly private things work. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Carl stayed off the stages. Dolly stayed on them. They met in the middle, on the farm, away from everything that wanted a piece of her. Their marriage survived the kind of pressures that destroy most marriages because Carl Dean had understood something from the very beginning that most people never figure out. That loving someone famous means accepting that they belong, partially, irreversibly, to the world. He accepted it. Every day, for 59 years, he accepted it. But what happens to the anchor when the anchor begins to drift? Around 2019, something changed. It changed quietly. The way all the most devastating things change, not with announcement or drama, but with small accumulations, with repeated patterns that slowly reveal themselves as something more than forgetfulness, something more than age. Carl Dean, who had spent 6 decades as the still point at the center of Dolly's spinning world, began to disappear inside himself. Alzheimer's disease. The word lands like a verdict, because that is what it is. A verdict handed down with no possibility of appeal, a sentence measured not in years, but in increments of erasure. The man who remembered everything, who had watched Dolly become Dolly, who had been present for every transformation and every triumph, was now being asked by his own dissolving memory to unknow all of it, including, eventually, her. Dolly did not make a public statement. She did not call a press conference. She did not write a carefully crafted social media post thanking everyone for their prayers and asking for privacy. She simply, with the same disciplined silence she had applied to every other private catastrophe of her life, came home and became his caretaker. She reduced the household staff to 2 people. She limited the visitors. She stayed close. "I rarely leave his bedside," she said. That sentence, delivered without drama, without a single note of self-pity, is one of the most quietly shattering things Dolly Parton has ever said publicly. This is a woman who sold out arenas for 5 decades. A woman whose entire professional identity was built on the stage, on the performance, on the extraordinary act of giving herself to massive audiences night after night. And she reduced that life, voluntarily, without hesitation, to a bedroom in Tennessee, to the man who had always been there when the performances were over. She had spent her life performing for millions. She spent those final years performing for an audience of 1. And then, in March of 2025, Carl Dean died, 82 years old, 59 years of marriage, nearly 60, just short of 60, close enough to 60 that the difference feels cruel. The man who never wanted to be famous died as he had lived, privately, away from cameras, in the company of the woman who had loved him since she was a girl from Locust Ridge, with big hair and bigger dreams, and absolutely no way of knowing what was coming. Can you imagine that silence? The silence of a house that was built around a person. And then that person is gone? She carried it. Of course she carried it, because Dolly Parton has been carrying things her whole life. Surgeries, and diagnoses, and grief, and loss, and the specific weight of a public persona that cannot afford to visibly break. And she carried this the way she carried all of it, quietly, completely, without asking anyone to witness it. The Las Vegas residency she had committed to, the shows, the lights, the rhinestones, the audiences who had bought their tickets months in advance, was canceled in September of 2025. The official language was careful. Health issues, recovery, the need to rebuild. The real language, for anyone paying attention, was simpler. She was worn down. She was worn out. She was grieving the man who had been her anchor for 6 decades. And she needed to stop moving long enough to feel it. She said it herself, in March of 2026, standing at the Dollywood opening day in the Tennessee mountains she had never really left, the mountains that made her and sustained her and would outlast all of them. "I just kind of got worn down and worn out grieving over Carl, and a lot of other little things going on. I just got myself kind of where I needed to build myself back up spiritually, emotionally, and physically. But all is good. It didn't slow me down." That last sentence, the performance instinct, firing even in the middle of the most honest thing she had said in years. It didn't slow me down, as though the woman who had just spent years at her husband's bedside, who had canceled her Las Vegas shows, who had admitted to being worn to the bone by grief, needed anyone to know she was still Dolly. Still standing. Still in full hair and makeup. Still here. She had spent 60 years building an image strong enough to carry everything. In the end, the image held. But the woman inside it had been through a fire that nobody fully saw. And she came out the other side carrying every scar, every tattoo, every grief, every butterfly. She came back in March of 2026, not with a press release, not with a carefully orchestrated media tour, not with the full machinery of celebrity rehabilitation spinning behind her, manufacturing the appearance of resilience for an audience hungry for reassurance. She came back the way she always comes back. She showed up. Dollywood. The theme park built on the Tennessee mountain land, where she grew up with bare floors and 12 siblings and a mother who made her a coat out of rags that she later turned into one of the most beloved songs in the American canon. The mountain that made her. The mountain she never really left, not even when the world was pulling at her from every direction. She stood there, in full hair, full makeup, full rhinestones, and said the truest thing she had said in years. I just kind of got worn down and worn out. 6 words. No performance, no deflection, no laugh deployed strategically to dissolve the weight of what she was saying. Just the admission, plain and unadorned, that the woman who had spent 60 years being indestructible for everyone else had finally, quietly, been destroyed, and had needed time alone with the rubble before she could begin rebuilding. Have you ever had to rebuild yourself from the inside, while the whole world was waiting for you to be fine? That is where Dolly Parton stood at 80 years old. Without Carl, without Las Vegas, without the forward momentum that had defined every decade of her adult life. Standing in the Tennessee mountains, with the grief of a 59-year marriage still fresh in her bones, the weight of years of caregiving still in her hands, the accumulated cost of 60 years of silence and performance, and long sleeves and pastel butterflies, all of it present, all of it real, all of it finally allowed to be seen. And she was building something anyway. Of course she was. The Songteller Hotel and Museum in Nashville, opening in June of 2026, a place built not around the image, but around the songs, around the 3,000 compositions that constitute the actual architecture of her life. The real autobiography, the one she has been writing since she was old enough to hold a pencil. Every song a document, every lyric a confession dressed in melody. Every 3-chord story, a piece of evidence that the woman behind the wigs was always more interesting than the wigs themselves. The Broadway musical, Dolly, a true original, arriving in 2026 with a title that is either a statement of fact or the most understated joke in theatrical history. Probably both. With Dolly, it is usually both. The Imagination Library, still running, still sending books to children in 40 countries, still being, quietly, the most consequential thing she has ever done. The love she extended outward when biology denied her the chance to extend it inward. Every book a butterfly, every delivery a scar transformed into something that gives instead of taking. That is the through line. That is the thing that holds when you trace the full arc, from Locust Ridge to the feeding tube scar, from the endometriosis diagnosis to the hysterectomy, from the pastel tattoos to Carl's bedside, from the Las Vegas cancellation to the Tennessee mountain where she stood in March of 2026 and told the truth about being worn down. She always transformed the wound into something that gives. The illness became the tattoos, became the butterflies. The hysterectomy became the Imagination Library, became 100 million children holding books with their names on the envelope. The grief of Carl's Alzheimer's became the most honest public admission she has ever made. That even Dolly Parton gets worn down. That even the most sustained performance in American music history has a woman inside it. A woman who bleeds. A woman who grieves. A woman who needed to rebuild herself spiritually, emotionally, and physically before she could stand on a mountain and say all is good. She is 80 years old. She is wearing long sleeves. Beneath them, the butterflies. Beneath the butterflies, the scars. Beneath the scars, the surgeries. Beneath the surgeries, the illness, the grief, the diagnosis, the years of caregiving. The 59-year marriage, the children who never came, and the millions of children who came anyway. The Depression survived privately, the image maintained publicly, the whole extraordinary hidden architecture of a life that the world thought it knew completely. We knew the surface. We loved the surface. The surface was magnificent. But what was underneath turned out to be the most interesting thing about her. We opened this story with a woman in long sleeves, standing in the light, hiding something the world was not allowed to see. We close it with the same woman, in the same sleeves, on the same Tennessee mountain where she began. Older, without her anchor, a little worn down, still building, still transforming every scar into a butterfly, every loss into a library, every private devastation into something public and luminous, and given freely to anyone who needs it. That is what Dolly Parton was always hiding under those sleeves. Not shame, not vanity, not the carefully guarded secret of a woman afraid to be seen. The evidence of everything she survived and chose, every single time, to make beautiful. If this story moved you, if you have ever covered a scar and called it something else, if you have ever kept performing while something inside you was quietly breaking, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think Dolly's real legacy will be. And if you want more stories like this one, the real stories, the ones behind the image, the ones that took decades to tell, subscribe. Because the most interesting chapter is always the one nobody knew existed.